started.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's book talk event, Intellect U Well Journeys. I'm Tanya Stancil. I'm one of the board members for Intellect U Well. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Intellect U Well, Inc. is a nonprofit organization that promotes reading, media literacy, digital citizenship, academic achievement, and self-improvement in the Houston, Texas community and beyond. I just want to quickly acknowledge our board members who we have on the call today. We have Dr. James Stancil, myself, Tanya Stancil. We also have Davin Stancil, as well as Mr. Tony Garrett, Mr. Pat Rumpf, and Dr. Justin Washington. Today, our Intellect U Well Journeys book talk theme is comics and graphic novels, featuring author and historian Jeffrey A. Brown, who has written extensively about African-American comic book creators and African-American culture and experiences in comics and graphic novels. So just a little bit more about our featured guest. Jeffrey Brown is Associate Professor in the Department of Popular Culture and the School of Critical and Cultural Studies at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Jeff holds a PhD in Anthropology from University of Toronto, and his current research activities include gender and body issues in film, corporate media culture, the role of vision in popular culture, urban ethnography, and comic book studies. Jeff is also an active curator of popular culture exhibitions for institutions such as the Toledo Museum of Art and the Royal Ontario Museum. He will discuss his most recent work, Panthers, Hulks, and Ironhearts, Marvel, Diversity, and the 21st Century Superhero, as well as the definitive book on the history of Black comic book company, Milestone Comics, titled Black Superheroes, Milestone Comics, and Their Fans. So we welcome Jeffrey to today's talk, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're really looking forward to some interesting conversation. So today's moderator is going to be James Stancil, who I mentioned is a member of the Board of Directors for Intellect U Well, and he also serves as the Chief Program Officer. As James is moderating discussion, we welcome any questions. You can post them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them either as we go throughout the discussion, or we also will leave time at the end for an open Q&A session. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to James, who will get us started with the discussion for today.
All right. Thank you, Miss Tanya. I hope everyone's doing well today. Professor Brown, how's everything going up there?
Things are going fine. We had a little bad weather, but otherwise we're all right.
All right. Well, if you have any difficulty with the weather or anything like that, we'll just kind of hold on for you to come back, because this is a big topic for us. We're so glad to have you here. This is our first really kind of deep dive into comics and graphic novels. And as you know, I mean, this stuff is everywhere now. We're talking about billions of dollars in movies and television. And, you know, we're a reading advocacy organization. So, you know, we really love the fact that people are watching the movies and the television and all that. But we want them to know that, you know, these exciting topics and stuff come from books and reading. And, you know, in many libraries now, as well as school libraries, you have graphic novels and even, you know, some comics and stuff in there. And they can also read online digitally. So if people like these topics and everything, and they like these movies, we want to encourage them to go back and read the books they come from, and read scholarship from scholars like you who have done a great job with the history and how it relates to all kind of different cultures and groups. So thank you so much for being here today with us, Jeff.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it. This is fun.
Awesome. So let's kind of get into a little bit about your background first, little Jeff, because, you know, people who tune in and watch us on YouTube or our podcast or stream live or come to our events in person, one of the first things we always talk about is, who are the scholars? Who are the writers? You know, what kind of background do you come from, and how easy or how difficult would it be for someone like me or someone like them to become you if they're interested in these kind of topics? So can you tell us a little bit about your background? How'd you get into scholarship and writing?
Sure. I'm not, I don't really know. It's kind of weird. You know, I just got into it, right? Like, I had friends whose parents, you know, I grew up in Toronto, just outside of Toronto, actually, in Canada. very urban area, very multicultural area, middle class, lower middle class kind of thing. And it was all I knew. And I ended up, my parents were both teachers, school teachers, middle school. And so I ended up, I went to university. Quite frankly, I didn't think I was going to get in. I was one of those goof off jock kids in high school. I was too busy playing hockey. Canadian, I had to. It's a law. And so I kind of didn't have the best grades, got into university, and then I found anthropology, and I thought, this is cool. This is really interesting, and ended up going on. And the light really turned on when I found I could look at things that I cared about. I always tell my students, anthropology is traditionally it's the study of culture, but it's always been sort of the study of the other culture. Go live in a hut in the outback of Australia and study a certain tribe and learn about them. And I always thought, shit, I don't understand my own culture that well. You can't spend a year in a culture and think you know it. I want to study popular culture, the culture that we're existing in. So I just kind of ended up stumbling through and then going to graduate school and shifting my focus to be on things that I was a fan of. So I think anybody from anywhere can do it. If you're passionate about something, whatever it is, you can get into it and learn a hell of a lot more about it. Sometimes you have to forge your own paths to get there. But I think, pursuing an academic interest in anything just means getting into it and reading a lot and thinking about it a lot.
I agree, and I'm so glad that you said that as well, Jeff. I mean, because getting into academics or going to college or whatever, you should want to do whatever it is that you're studying. You need to find something that you're interested in. And a lot of people think comics and comic books and stuff like that. No one wants to know about that, but they do. I mean, everything is ripe for scholarship. And so that's awesome that you've kind of gotten into this. And anthropology, you're right. A lot of times people think about you're on some island somewhere studying some kind of tribes, right? But it could be, people here within the United States or Canada. I guess, are you kind of studying us a little bit too, Jeff? When you came to the United States, are you studying us Americans? Is that how it works?
I tell my students that all the time. I teach this large lecture class with 300 students. So I play the dumb foreigner, right? I go, I don't know what's going on. I've been here for 20 years now. But I will play dumb come Thanksgiving. I'll okay, you guys tell me about it. And it works. You can play it up and they start to realize that they have rituals, that they have things that they do, and trying to get them to explain it. Explain to me what your graduation ceremonies are. How many of you got money from people for graduating high school? I'd never heard of that before, but they can elaborate on that, and then it's something different. And it's a fun way to get them to explain things. Now, there's a lot of the U.S. I do not understand, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, we can have that topic offline. I'm sure I know some of the things you don't understand, probably.
I don't want to get too political, but yeah.
Yeah. That's a discussion for another. Maybe your next book, if you do something with some political comics, we can come back and talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about. And you've written all different types of books, but today we're mainly going to focus on two: your book on Milestone Comics and your book on diversity and on Marvel in the 21st century. But let's kind of go in a little more depth about what was your motivation for writing, writing about books about comics in general, and then we can kind of specifically talk about your book on Milestone Comics, but just in general this topic.
Yeah. And again, it sort of just came about organically. I mean, The book on Milestone was my dissertation that I then turned into a book. So I had the luxury of doing a lot of research, field research and stuff. And I was in an anthropology program and I wanted to study this. And some of the faculty members were like, no, that's not anthropology. And I was like, let me give it a shot. I want to study fandom. I want to study what things were. And everything I read said comics were this. They were just very straight, just masculine, predominantly white, and the fandoms reflected that. And I was like, that's not my experience. That's not what I'm seeing when I go to cons and bookstores and stuff like that. I'm seeing a lot of everything. And so I just started studying that, and that developed into a much bigger project than I expected. And I got lucky because it was the early to mid 90s, and there was a comics boom coming out. Like everybody was starting their own company, and the Milestone guys got together, and they were all professionals in the field, and they said, let's start up a company that focuses on diverse characters. Our first 3 books will be African American heroes, all written and illustrated initially by African American creators, and then as they expanded into other ethnicities and sexualities and differences in a lot of different ways. And I wrote them, and they were great about it. They said, hey, come on down to New York, spend some time, let's talk about this. So it was just a lucky merging of interests, I think, at the same time.
And that's what happens sometimes. You reach out to people. I reached out to you, about this, and when we do these talks in person, and hopefully people will kind of gather that from people who are on our live discussion or who watch it later on YouTube, is that you're very approachable. You're a nice fella, and you're interested in these topics just like they are, and so there's really not a difference, other than you took that next step to kind of do the research and make those calls, but they could do it too, either in their communities or whatever the topic or the situation is. And I'm going to tell you, back in those mid 90s, when I saw your book on Milestone, because I was out there with Milestone, I was like, this is awesome. I'm glad somebody's writing about this topic. This will be something, that I would love to write about or find out more about. And, and in reading that, I learned more about, those type of things. Now, I was one that I was interested in comic book writing and stuff like that. But, people told me, you don't do that, or you're not out of New York, or, whatever, and you can't do that. And nobody wants to hear about those things that you, want to write about. But here's my Milestone, here's Dwayne McDuffie, so on and so forth. And then I learned more about them through your book. Little would I know, almost 30 years later, here we are on Blue Jeans on the internet talking about this thing, right?
Yeah. No, they were wonderful, because I wrote them, and I was just sort of like, hey, I love your work, big fan. And I'm thinking, I sound like an idiot. These guys are famous. These guys are doing great stuff. They don't want anything to do with me. And they wrote me back immediately, or called me and said, hey, yeah, we totally see the value of this. Let's talk. So it was great. And I think they were open to tons of people. And I think any of your listeners, if they're interested in that, or if they want to talk to their favorite authors or something like that, shoot them an email. People want to talk, especially about their own stuff. I mean, we're all egotistical that way, so they'll chat.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, reach out and talk to people and let them know, right, that you're interested in, and you never know what kind of motivation you could lead to something, even further down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of talking about the scholarship piece, Jeff, how long did it take for you to complete? I know this was your dissertation book. So, how long did it take for you to kind of complete this work, and what type of methods did you use? Clearly, you use interviews and stuff, but what else, kind of went into this process for you with the Milestone?
Yeah, a lot of research. I like to say part of the fun of my research was I got to read an awful lot of comic books. But obviously, it's not just comic books. It's in anthropology, the main method is ethnography, which is getting out and participating, being involved, not just observing, but talking to people, not doing interviews so much as, chatting with them, finding out how they're using the materials, what they're getting out of them, what appeals to them about these stories. So that was really the main approach. And then as they started to shape it, the readers really started to give me a clue as to what they liked about it in a way that isn't literary. It's not like doing literary studies where you're like, okay, here's what I think is going on in the book. It's here's what they like about it. They liked the fact that these characters, yes, they were Black, but B, they were smart, and C, they knew the history of Black superhero characters in film and in comics, and they interacted with that. So that really led me to, the academic areas that I needed to get in touch with, particularly in relation to gender and masculinity as part of that presentation, because Milestone was very carefully talking about black masculine presence in a genre where sometimes black masculine presence has been problematic or negative in a lot of cases.
So the book we're specifically talking about, and it came out 2000.
I think it was 2000. Yeah.
Yeah, December 2000. And it's still available, right? Black
It's still available. There
superheroes.
we go.
Boom, right there. Jeff, I love it. You got it right there for us. But it's Black superheroes, Milestone Comics, and their fans. And as Tanya said, the definitive book on Milestone Comics, and Milestone Comics is back, right?
They are back. And in a weird way, they kind of never went away. I mean, they were kept corporately alive, legally alive, in their partnership with DC Comics. So those properties didn't disappear. So even after the comic books fell victim to the bust in independent publishers in the late 90s, then we still had the Static Shock TV show. The characters kept popping up every now and then. Dwayne McDuffie, who was one of the founders of Milestone, when he wrote Justice League of America for a while, he brought most of the Milestone characters in some weird, multiverse crossover sort of thing. And now they're back full force.
All right. The Dakotaverse, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, they figured out a way to merge it all together. So
absolutely. So for those who have not read that book, or maybe aren't familiar with it and maybe want to kind of get into it a little bit, or like me, it's been a while, can you kind of give us some highlights or what people can expect if they pick up your book on Milestone Comics, kind of a brief summary, so to speak?
Sure. It's really about the fans of the book of the Milestone books, of the multiple series there, and how they read and interpret those books, not just as some weird power fantasy, I win because I'm stronger than you, because I'm Superman, because I can beat up people and so on. But it's that they take a different approach. So looking at how those characters work within the genre, because there's very clear genre rules for superheroes, right? Every superhero has to have a secret identity or a sidekick or some kind of weakness and an arch enemy. And it manages to have all of those things and go in new directions. And what people, I think, mistakenly assumed was that the hook for Milestone was just that the superheroes were black, for at least the
black versions.
Yeah, and that wasn't what they were about. I mean, they were and they weren't. They were about that, and it was an important depiction of African American characters, but they still did things in a way that was better than Superman could or Batman could in some stories. They were very creative and did a lot of stuff, and that's kind of the thing that the fans really tapped into and really appreciated about it. So it's about the fans and their interpretation and how it helps shape their world. Especially as fans of a medium that hasn't always had the best depictions, where African American characters has a long history of racist depictions and buffoonish depictions or thuggish depictions. And so they were reading these also in contrast to those, in contrast to other more militantly political minority-based comics, and also in relation to other sort of hyper-masculine images in rap music, sports, that kind of, within the context of, in the 80s, you had LL Cool J and, Run DMC and these characters, and then these Milestone characters all kind of in conversation with each other,
right,
for the fans.
Right.
I'm not sure if that made any sense.
Oh, it did. I mean, within the cultural context of that time period, right? You mentioned LL Cool J, and I was immediately thinking back of Run DMC, with the Adidas with no shoestrings, the Kango hat and all that. Yeah, I mean, but you weren't necessarily thinking about the alien hero or the wealthy Black American who was similar to an Iron Man type, that you saw with some of those characters from Milestone. So yeah, let's kind of talk about some of those for people who may not be as familiar. And then I guess if we get some questions, Tanya, people have some questions as we go, they can type them in or we can go live. But I did want to, because this is one of your older books, so some of the people who are a little younger than than we are, other than Static Shock, they may not be as familiar. But my two favorite Milestone characters were Hardware and Icon. But maybe you could talk about them and kind of explain a little bit, but also maybe some of your favorites or some of the fans from that time period were more interested in. Of course, Static Shock, but we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But just kind of give them kind of an overview of the Dakotaverse and Milestone.
Sure, yeah. Those were my two favorites too. And I think Icon, and you know what, Rocket, his sidekick Rocket was my favorite. I'll go with that. But Icon was a really interesting character. I mean, it got criticized too much for being this is Black Superman, because he's an alien, he's got the cape, he's got the same powers basically as Superman, although he's a wealthy lawyer in his disguise and Republican, and then Rocket, Raquel, who becomes his sidekick, breaks in and they're robbing his house, and he confronts her and says, you need to do more to uplift the race, and using strange, or what we're seeing by her as outdated terms at that point, and so on. So she ends up calling his bluff on it when she finds out he's got superpowers and he's an alien, and they become basically Superman and his sidekick Rocket, who he hooks up with some superpowers and so on. But it's interesting because then they take that switch to say, if this is Superman, Superman, everybody knows Superman's story, right? He gets sent like Moses on an alien ship. He crash lands, gets raised by a nice white couple in Kansas, has that all-American small town upbringing. What if he landed in a plantation and he's actually a shape-shifting alien who adopts African-American form because of who he's raised by, who he identifies with, and so on. And then they managed to use him to trace through in later comics, this Black struggle from centuries, as he's moved up, and how he has played out and blended in and not blended in over centuries. So really doing some interesting stuff there. Just by that one subtle tweak, and then handling it well throughout. Let's see, who was the other? Hardware. Hardware is awesome. Hardware is likened as basically Iron Man. And again, there's nothing new in comics, right? So saying he's the Black Iron Man, yeah, we also have every other version of Iron Man. And, every company's got rich, smart guy who builds a suit or something. Just like every company's got the guy who can swim real fast or run real fast or turn invisible. There's only like 6 main powers, and everybody's got a version of it. So their Milestone Universe's Iron Man kind of character happens to be a Black inventor who's super smart, and creates a suit for himself and fights crime and fights the evil corporation. But then it really gets into issues of systemic racism and the history of being disadvantaged and access to education, things like that. So a lot of interesting stuff. And the criticism at the time that all they did was change the ethnicity of the characters. That's all anybody does, right? Like that. I don't mean that's all anybody does. I mean, that's what comics do. They have a set number of stock characters that you can make little changes to. And we still see that nowadays, where what if this character was gay? What if this character was old? What if this character was transgender? And Milestone, I think, was one of the first, the older readers will know, or ask your parents or your grandparents. Marvel used to have what if series where they would imagine, what if Spider-Man was
I was going to mention that.
And so Milestone said, we can take that and run with it. These don't have to be imaginary what if stories. These could be main central stories where we diversify the type of people who put on a cape and have superpowers.
And what if it's popular again because it's on Disney Plus? They brought it back.
Exactly. Yeah. So it all comes around, right? There's no new ideas.
Right. But and I'm sure DC has to be, looking at the writing on the wall and what's going on in popular culture right now. And because, we were just talking about Hardware and Icon and their stories and those kind of things. That was 90s, and this stuff is still potentially even more relevant today. That those kind of stories and topics, if they started Milestone Comics today, what if, right? If they started Milestone Comics today, it wouldn't be a part of DC, and they would be billionaires probably telling those kinds of stories.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why they're bringing it back. I think DC's looking at it a little bit corporate greed, like, hey, you know what? We've got this whole diverse range of characters, and the fans still love them. The fans kept them alive.
Right.
And they're like, you know what? We can breathe new life into them. And we're looking at what's going on over at Marvel. We're looking at the diversity of characters. The movies and the television shows have really boosted things, right? So they've proven that there's an audience. Black Lightning on television on the CW is doing great. So many of the live action Teen Titans movie or television shows have diversity. And, you can't ignore what happened with the Black Panther movie. I mean, people were like, oh, this is a big risk. And then it became one of the top 5 highest grossing movies of all time. It was well done, and it showed a huge craving that it didn't matter. The logic in Hollywood has always been, if it's an African-American hero, it's going to appeal to African-American audiences, not all audiences.
Right.
Which is strange, and Milestone disproved that. Milestone disproved it. Black Panther took it to the bank.
Yes.
Slam dunked that in the wallet where they listen, and that was not a niche market. That was a massive worldwide audience. So I think that's one of the things that's most important now is getting past that, because historically there's always been the assumption that Black audiences have to read across a line. You can imagine yourself as a superhero, but it has to look like Superman because that's who we have the image of. Now we've got little kids imagining themselves as Black Panther. The heroism matters more than the ethnicity, I think, right when you get down to that pure level of the kid and the enjoyment of that fantasy. Who cares about the ethnicity or the gender or the sexuality? It's still a fun fantasy, no matter what.
Absolutely. And, I think it's important for people to know and understand the history of Milestone, and in the sense that this stuff didn't just start with Black Panther, and even where it didn't start with Milestone either, but that's for no whole other.
Black Panther and Luke Cage were before Milestone.
Yeah, right.
They were
That's a whole other,
that.
but in terms of that independent company that was really had those kind of stories and was not just clones, you're just changing the color palette, so to speak, that it was very different. And I think it's great that it fits into today's world, and that people have the opportunity to go back on, Amazon or any of these other companies that sell books and buy your book and understand and kind of get a feel for that history during that time, and what it was like, and when it was all new and fresh. Of course, we're still new and fresh as well, Jeff. We don't want to age ourselves on that. We're still new and fresh. But Jeff, how old were you then? I mean, you had to be.
How old am I? I'm 55. And which is also, forget my age. The rest of me surprises people when they read the Milestone book, and then they meet me. I go to a conference and show up, and they're like, "Dude, you're white. You are not." You're like this middle-aged white Canadian dude. What do you? And the response was always fantastic, right from the beginning, right from the Milestone guys themselves when I first showed up in their offices in New York. And I always thought that's one of the most important things is getting people to read and understand um, across ethnicities. I hate the idea that you have to be the same skin color or the same religion or the whatever to study things of that community or of that area. There's certain ways you have to do it, but we need to all understand each other in a way. And
Absolutely.
I think it was Bell Hooks who said, we'll only believe that African American studies have come a certain way, a certain distance, once they're not only being done by African American scholars. And I thought, that's right, that everybody needs to be looking at these things. These are just variables of personhood.
And I'm also hoping too, Jay, and that's great. And a lot of when we do our intellectual book talks and stuff, we have people from all backgrounds with subjects, different subjects. And like you said, sometimes they're surprised when they turn on the camera and there's Jeffrey A. Brown there. They were expecting something totally different. But one of the things that we're hoping for as well is that people feel like, they can become Jeffrey A. Brown. They can write about these topics, and you'd be willing to help them, and they can use your work as a guide to talk about these topics within our community as well as across communities. So that's the important thing as well, because we have a lot of young people that we work with, particularly two of our board members, Dr. Washington and Pat Rump with 100 Black Men of Metro Houston. How come some of those young men who are interested in comics and anime and those kind of things, they could research and study and do things just like you, right? So if you were going to speak to them, what would you say?
Do it. Whatever your passion is, you gotta just go for it. And there's no reason why you couldn't, whether it's on the creative side, if you're a young person who likes the art and is drawing and putting words and pictures together or writing scripts, go for it. There's no reason why you can't. The entertainment industry, completely democratic. I mean, there are disadvantages, there is systemic racism, there are problems like that, but you know what, if you really work at your craft, you can possibly break through. Like, comics is a unique industry in that it doesn't, to get your foot in the door, it doesn't take a couple $1,000,000. You don't need a feature film length reel. You can draw a few pages, take them to a con, show them to people, and garner interest. You can write some scripts, write some short stories. You don't have to have a best-selling book
Right.
to do these things. And academically, you can study anything. I got to
Yes.
study comics. Shocked the hell out of my mom. My mom still doesn't understand. My mom looked at me, how'd you even get out of high school, let alone get a PhD? Um, but yeah, you can do anything, and whatever it is, and I enjoy comics when I do that. I have friends who are marine biologists. They're fish fanatics. They like fish,
Right.
and they got into that. Somebody who likes Shakespeare becomes an English professor or writes books. So whatever it is you're into, you can take it more seriously. Just think about it.
I think that's great, and that's great advice, Jeff. Thank you. We've got a question in the chat from Brother Tony Garrett here. I'll read it, and then you can answer it, and then if he wants to add on to it, Tony, you can come off of your mute as well. But he says, Jeff, do you think the diversification of the Milestone characters can be merged into the current fan demand for action and heroes across the spectrum of comic movies? Great question, Tony.
Yes, I certainly hope so. But I think more than some of the others, it's because they were created um, from a particular, uh, from an informed perspective, that they have the possibility of establishing a whole normalized universe, where it isn't just, oh, we plucked Black Lightning and gave him a show. But if they can bring in the whole Dakota universe, it'd be great.
Mhm.
If they can have that, because you want that character, you want those superheroes who don't have to represent the entire race or the entire gender or something. That's why
Right.
it's a problem when you only have Wonder Woman, when you only have one Asian character or something. You want to be able to have an African American character who's a by the book standard hero. You want to have the smart ass kid. You want to have the guy who's a bit of an arrogant asshole. You want to have all these different people to really flesh it out. And I think that that's what Milestone brings is
Mhm.
central characters with a lot of different personalities.
Right. Because you don't represent all Canadians, right?
God, I hope not. Yeah, no, I do not. I do not. Uh,
Right. So yeah, you having different different characters, right? So let me just say this too, just for clarification, because I mentioned the Dakota verse earlier, and you talked about Dakota a little bit. Let's just explain to people what is Dakota in relation to Milestone.
Dakota it's and they joke about it. It's not North Dakota, it's not South Dakota. It's just Dakota. It's just the city. And it's their version of, Metropolis or Gotham, right? It's
Right.
basically New York-ish, but it's not New
Okay.
York. It's fictional, and it's a site where they had a big bang, where there was a protest going on, I believe, in the original, and the police released this gas that affected 10% of the people and gave them superpowers. So suddenly you've got all these people who were there, good and bad. Static Shock. Virgil was just there to try and impress a girl, I believe, and suddenly he's got electric powers, and he becomes sort of the smartass Spider-Man teenager going through puberty and having powers kind of character. But yeah, Dakota becomes their city, their fictional city for this kind of thing to go on. Yeah.
Very DC-esque, you
Yes.
know, compared to Marvel that uses real cities. In DC you have Coast City, Metropolis, Gotham City, so on and so forth. Right. So also now you have Dakota City, and so the stories from the Milestone Comics, the icons and the hardwares, etc., take place in the city of Dakota, which is the Dakota verse, people say, because if it's not within DC, if it's not within Miles, it's an alternate universe kind of situation there, the Dakota verse. So if you are not familiar with that, if you hear me or Jeff talk about Dakota, that's what we're talking about. And it's interesting, Jeff, just to follow up on that, you talk about that 10% piece, and I had forgotten about kind of how they kind of got their powers. Marvel has the mutants and, so on and so forth. But I think about the talented 10th of W.E.B. Du Bois, going back to the Souls of Black folk, the 10% of people that, should take care and be the leaders and take care and protect the race and all those kind of things. And, I'm wondering, we don't, maybe you talked with them about that back then, but, I'm wondering if that's kind of where they got that from. Or I don't know if you ever asked them that.
You know what? We didn't talk about that specifically, and um, I think the Milestone guys were very astutely, they were aware of the things they were touching on without wanting to emphasize them too directly. They were very clear about these are entertainment. Political themes, social messages will filter their way in, but they really didn't want to seem heavy-handed, I think, with that.
Right.
There was, at the time, and I think I mentioned in the book, there was a perception among fans, the worst thing you could do with a comic was have a ABC after-school special, which was in the 70s and 80s. These, we're going to do a serious issue about the dangers of hitchhiking or of drugs, or they were very don't do this kind of thing, and they were never entertaining. They always came across as a little stupid and preachy, and the Captain America says don't do drugs gets laughed at by fans. So I think the Milestone people really wanted to distance themselves from that, but they weren't picking 10% by accident.
Right.
So the stuff was getting in there even without being explicitly explained.
And we have to, again, think back to the time period. That's not 2022 we're talking about. We're talking about mid to late 90s. And it was a different world then, We like to think it was pretty current like it is now, but I mean, we talk about Rodney King, we talk about O.J. Simpson, that kind of time period for those of us who are old enough to have lived. Some of those kinds of things. So it's a different world. You can talk about things a lot differently and be more open about things now than you could have and would have then. And people also have to think about the fact this is not necessarily scholarship like you do or like I do. This is entertainment. They're trying to get money and get paid. And so you're not trying to necessarily be so outward with stuff that you're alienating people that you want to potentially buy your book. So that's something to consider as well. Tony, did we kind of answer your question a little bit there? Anything you want to add on to that?
Oh, James, the question was answered really well. I see now that we're talking about this topic and that Jeff is explaining a few things. I can see the merging. I think there's a need, not only a need, but there's a want for more characters. And just to plug this, that I did go see Doctor Strange yesterday, and I won't say anything about it. But I think that, like me, just on a Saturday, I want something to do, but I want something interesting to do, so I go see that. And if there were some Milestones characters that had movies, or they were injected into some of the Marvel or some of those type of stories, of course I would go see them. And then, like you said, the generation now, they would be able to re-explore as well as find out about, characters that have been around but they didn't know about or didn't know much about. And history can be taught at the same time, like you brought up about the souls of black folk. Just like they're having another Avatar movie coming out the end of the year. So I'm using that as an example that history is being taught and can be taught through things like this. And it would be a great thing if they could inject some of those characters, or like Jeff said, all of the characters at once. So thank you, Jeff.
And you very well may see a movie pretty soon. I mean, you're going to see Static Shock, but I'm telling you, there's money to be made out there. I mean, they're making money off of Wakanda and Black Panther. I can totally see the city of Dakota next. We might be in it, Tony. You never know. They might need some extras.
I went in on that too. Yeah, there's no reason why they couldn't, right? I mean, Black Panther did huge, and so have other properties, right? Like Luke Cage on Netflix did fine. It's hard to get the ratings out of Netflix, but it was successful. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great show. Mm-hmm. And we might be getting into this in a little bit, but Marvel's Disney Plus series, bringing in Sam Wilson as Falcon in the movies, but then, giving them that promotion and moving it along with this Disney Plus film, and then the next Captain America is going to be him. So, but they didn't rush it. I mean, I think they're handling things a little bit better nowadays by having him in the. I don't want to spoil the Disney Plus show if you haven't seen the Captain America Winter Soldier, or whatever that
Falcon
was.
and Winter Soldier.
Falcon and Winter Soldier, yeah. That he really deliberates about what's it mean for a black man to carry that shield with the stars and stripes on it, and that they introduce, the man who was injected with the super soldier serum before Captain America was, before Steve Rogers was. And so, bringing up things like, it raises issues of why certain ethnicities might have been nervous about getting a COVID shot, that the government entrusting vaccines, Tuskegee experiments, and, all of that gets worked in there. So there's a lot of history, and it was kind of fun. And I don't mean it was fun, but it was an interesting way to introduce things. Because I know after that series came out, I talked to my students, and they were completely confused. Why was this guy angry that he had gotten the super soldier serum before Steve Rogers if it gave him superpowers? And then we talked about, syphilis and African American soldiers being injected with that by the government and forced into these things. And it was, you could see eyes opening that this had happened, and that the soldier serum becomes kind of this metaphor for stuff.
Tuskegee syphilis study, right?
Yeah. So, alluding to something like that, a really dark moment in history, but bringing that out as part of the language of what's going on with these things is an interesting educational moment.
Yeah. And it's so funny you mentioned, I was just about to get into that too, Jeff. That was one of my favorite comics as well, that Morales and Cal Baker, Cal Baker's you probably met him. I haven't met him, but he's been my hero, the black comic book writer and artist. But right, Captain America Rebirth, they integrated that story into the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which was a retcon saying that Captain America was not the first Captain America, that they had experimented on those black soldiers to be able to perfect that formula. And I used to just share that with my students all the time. We were talking about media studies and stuff like that. And I never heard of that. I never heard of that. And I would share that comment with them. And then now it's been, really emphasized more in that Disney Plus series. But for the record, I would say the government did not inject Tuskegee black males in that area. They just not give them the treatment when the treatment became available. Because we're media literacy as well, so we have to make sure that that I make it clear that they just did not give them treatment, which was unethical. But once they developed the proper treatment for syphilis, they did not give those black males that treatment, and so they suffered horrifically, and they studied them to tell how syphilis would, in advanced stages of syphilis, would people would respond to that, and that's horrible. And now, in terms of medical ethics,
guinea pigs, and
right.
Yeah.
And we talk about that a lot in terms of research methods and stuff. As you know, at the university level, that's one of the things that people talk about. And Miss Evers' Boys, the play, and then the movie, some people may know about this from that, or the book Bad Blood, or Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington. Any of those kind of books talk about Tuskegee syphilis study. All right. But you can get a little taste of it from Disney Plus, right? Captain Falcon and Winter Soldier. They definitely talk about that. The Black Captain America, the original Black Captain America, so to speak.
The original and the new, right? Like they bring it full circle, and they have some very serious discussions about it, which is eye-opening to people. And they managed to do it within a show that's fun and still has all that action and people flying around and throwing cars. But yeah, I think they're doing it in a very sophisticated way. And then they're coming out with a lot more diversity in the next couple of years.
Well, hold on, Jeff. That's your second book we're going to talk about.
Okay.
We're gonna get into that a little bit, but we gave them a little taste with the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Tony, have you had a chance to see that yet, Tony?
I haven't seen the series, James, but I'm familiar with it. I've had friends of mine that they talk about it a lot, and exactly what Jeff was saying, and a lot of history is there. We just pay attention, and just redundant things that have continued to happen over and over and just told inside the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so I did want to ask you a little bit, Jeff, about what do you think some of the topics from those milestone years, how it relates to popular culture today in history. But we've kind of already gotten into that a little bit. But anything that maybe you want to add that we hadn't already addressed, because it's important in 2022.
It is. I mean, it's the milestone stuff. Like you were saying, this was 30 years ago, and for those of us who were alive then, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. But it was, and it was a different world in a lot of ways. You're right. We just had the Rodney King riots and the OJ's last run and the chase and all that stuff. And in many ways it's different, but in many ways it isn't too. I mean, we still have, a lot of concerns going on. There's white nationalists and replacement theory and attacks on teaching critical race theory in schools, still having, police abuse and the death of lots of young men, in particular, Black young men, at the hands of terrorists and police and so on. So a lot of the issues haven't changed, and I do think there is room for more positive images or more positive depictions in something that this is a genre in movies and television that dominates right now. For the last 20 years, it's all been superheroes. I mean, that's all anybody cares about. That's where the big money is. And the more that can be diversified, I think the more it can do to help with some of the perceptions that go on and the problems that are going on in America right now.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. We're getting close to time for us to take a little break here. So you can drink some out of that Daredevil mug a little bit, maybe go to the restroom and all that, and we'll start talking about your second book. But I did, Tanya, who's our mistress of ceremonies, I want to maybe give everybody a chance if they want to have any last questions or comments on Jeff's book about Milestone before we move on to his next book after a short break. Tony, you good for now on Milestone, or anything else you want to add?
No, both of you, you and Jeff both covered it. It's just like he just said that things continue to happen, but I think that this is an opportunity, and that was an opportunity to say, hey, look at this in a different manner through comics and through superheroes to give some people to look at somebody and say, hey, looks like me, let me pay attention to what's happening. So it's a little teaching of history in a different manner, and I think that's good.
And Tony, I would love to have some young people read some of these Milestone comics from back then. They're all available digitally, and as a graphic novels. And some of those stories, like you said, are timeless, and they can see the black millionaire who invents the suit, and all those kind of things, or the black alien. You got this new series, The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is the old David Bowie. Now you got the black guy playing that role, or the brother from another planet. Back
Yeah, I
in
remember
in
that.
the 90s, how similar
Yeah.
or how different,
Yeah.
with that. But we could
And,
talk about
and
that.
James,
Yes, sir.
yeah, and James, I think I apologize. So I think that's a good thing. We have a young men and women's conference in June, and I think you just brought up something. I may have one of our breakout sessions and just go over those things and utilize digitally some of those comics to
Hmm.
enlighten them about, and they may be interested because some of the young people, believe it or not, they may not read the paper version, but they'll go online and they'll go inside their phone and take a look at these things. So I think that's a good idea. So I'm going to bring it up in our next meeting and make that one of the breakout sessions, maybe 15, 20 minutes of speaking about those comics.
Hmm.
So thanks a lot for that.
And Static Shock, as you heard Jeff now talking about, they may remember that, their parents would, that series, the comic series and all that. And I'm sure Tony Jeff probably be interested in working with that next month as well.
I'd be
All right,
happy
I'll
to.
reach out to Jeff. Okay, I'll reach
Sure.
out to you. And that would be great, Jeff, and we appreciate you.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And I think the milestone stuff, um, boy, they just reprinted the first 10 issues of their four main series
Hmm.
I'll show it to you when we get back. Huge volume, like a giant volume. So if the kids, if if young readers want it, it's available now without having to pay collector prices, in a nicely bound version. But also the fact that they've reintroduced all those series. They can go to a comic book store and find them right now, updated for today.
Hmm.
All right,
Or
thanks,
Jeffrey, I
Jeff.
always like to emphasize this as well. A public library, you know, libraries have comics, and they will order them for you if you ask.
Yep. Yeah. And some of them have online comics. They've digitized a lot of
Yes,
comics, so you can kind of rent them from or not rent them, but borrow them from the library digitally, which is a great resource.
absolutely. So, any other questions from anyone else that's here? I think we're probably good for now. Tanya, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, and we can take a little halftime break, and then we'll come back and talk about our next book.
Okay, that sounds good. So we want to take, what, 5 or 6 minute break, or do we need longer than that? So we
I
can
think that's fine. We can get back right back at it at 4.
four. Okay. All
Sounds
right,
good.
sounds good.
All right.